and in this video we're going to look at critique plays, or ways that you can win with the critique in the 2&R. I believe that there are 5 main plays that you can use in the 2&R in order to win with the criticism. The first is the alternative solves the AF with a risk of a net benefit. Second, the impact from the critique outweighs with a solid link. Third, case doesn't solve with a risk of a link and an impact. Fourth, make a framework argument that makes the AF irrelevant or a reason why it can't solve with a link and an impact. And fifth, use the critique as a link turn and have an external impact in order to beat the AF. In order to have all 5 plays available to you inside of the 2&R, you are going to have to make sure the following argumentation occurred somewhere in the block. First, you are going to have reasons why the alternative is able to solve for the AF. Second, impact magnitude claims have to be made. Third, solvency takeouts. Fourth, a framework argument. And fifth, link turns to the affirmative. The first play that you could go for in the 2&R is that the alternative solves the AF with a risk of the net benefit. In order to win with this, you are making a typical counterplan net benefit argumentation. The alternative solves 100% of the AF impacts, and their 1% risk of a net benefit means you should vote negative. So when you go for this, there's a few things you need to make sure that are occurring. The first is you need to explain why the alternative can solve all of the impacts of the affirmative. That means each and every impact scenario that they have has to be explained in terms of why the alternative would be able to resolve those impacts. Any miss of any of those scenarios will inevitably cause the 2AR to argue that there is a risk of the AF scenario that outweighs the criticism. So you got to make sure to be very detail-oriented and go through each one of the scenarios. The second thing is you really want to make the 1% risk of a link analysis, which means if they do not have reasons why the alternative can't solve the AF, you need to be making the 1% alternative solving 100% of the AF means 1% risk of a link, vote negative, because it would make it 1% better than the affirmative. Third, you need to make sure you have good link analysis. This will also help insulate you against the permutation that you should answer in the 2&R, obviously. And the impact. You should still do some impact calculus, but mainly you are going to want to focus on any risk of, you're going to want to make even if arguments that focus on even if they do win a solvency deficit of some sort, the criticism should still outweigh because. That way, if you make that sort of even if scenario, it will be able to help the judge write a ballot that can preempt some of the 2AR arguments that they are going to go for. The second play that you could do is an impact outweighs with a solid link. So a few things you're going to do when you go for this play in the 2&R is you're going to spend 2 to 3 minutes really making sure that you are controlling the impact calculus. You want to make sure that each warrant as to why war and extinction are answered and explained as to why they don't outweigh your critique, because they are going to be going for the case outweighs as the reason why you should lose the debate. So you want to make sure that every war or extinction or basically any reason why they have articulated a impact should outweigh your critique, you need to make sure you're answering that. If you do not answer that, it gives the judge a real easy way to vote affirmative. The third thing that needs to be done on the impact analysis is you need to watch out for these arguments as to why the AF impacts prevent the impact of the critique, i.e., or e.g., there are good cards out there that say that war causes racism. So you need to make sure that you answer those sort of claims so that the judge doesn't see a reason why the affirmative would be slightly link-turning the impact to the criticism. Second thing you would need to focus on is link analysis. Make sure that you've got that going on. And third, you want to make some ballot framing arguments. You should go for role of the ballot, uniqueness framing, or a linear impact framing. You need to sort of frame why one of those things means that the impact to the criticism should outweigh everything else. You need to make sure to explain why those things make it so that even if the criticism and the impacts to the criticism are non-unique and inevitably going to happen in the status quo, why the judge should still vote for you. This is a necessary component in order to prevent the affirmative from being like, those impacts are inevitable, but with the AF we still get to live for a little bit, so you should vote affirmative. So they might make some time frame arguments. So that's why this framing is necessary in order to prevent sort of the affirmative from pivoting towards just a case outweighs, it's good to be alive sort of argumentation that could occur in the 2AR. The next one is the case doesn't solve with a risk of a link and an impact. So a decent chunk of time will be spent explaining why the affirmative can't solve any of their AF. And so the bottom half of the 2R should focus on each and every scenario, usually on the link level and on the impact level, as to why the affirmative isn't able to solve. You should be mixing together different critique theory arguments and different normal critique or normal case arguments that are topic specific and weaving them together. The more you can weave those arguments together and make them form a cohesive story, the better it will be for you to convince the judge that the AF isn't going to be able to solve, because many 2ARs and many judges prefer specificity. So you got to make sure that that weaving occurs so the affirmative can't stand up in the 2AR and just be like, specificity means you vote AF. You need to make sure there's link analysis and the 1% of a risk link argument can be attached to it, but it should be more of an even if framing as opposed to the affirmative framing where you have the AF gotten rid of by the alternative. And then lastly, you want to make sure you're doing some impact calculus and make some even if arguments about even if the AF does win some arguments, that it still shouldn't overwhelm whatever the link and the impact is to the criticism, especially when you start thinking about terms of like probability that can occur because of all the work you've done in the bottom half of the 2R with the AF can't solve. The next is the framework makes the AF irrelevant or it can't solve. So there's a bunch of different arguments you can make here, but you want to use framework as a filtering question, i.e. that in order for the affirmative to make any claim, they have to first filter it through your framework argument. So this can be simple as no spill up, like we don't have our hands on the levers of power, political persuasion is not a thing and doesn't occur inside of society. Those could be filtering questions. So if debate doesn't leave the room, or even if it does leave the room, it doesn't cause political change, what is the value of their education? And that can be paired with some role of the ballot arguments, i.e. make a teleological argument as to what the end point of the debate is. For example, it could be the telos of the ballot, and what you're kind of striving for is to figure out the best method to fight racism or fight white supremacy, etc., which means that using framework as a reason why we don't have our hands on the levers of power and that education should be the thing that is focused on in the debate, that it really allows you to frame out or filter out the affirmative's ability to make it relevant to the judge's decision. This also can be used to supercharge and explain why the alternative is able to provide uniqueness to the impacts that are occurring, and that's usually some sort of educational argument that is taking place. The second thing you need, link analysis. Pretty standard stuff. Third, impact arguments. Now, it will work better when you are making an ethicality argument with your impacts, or an ontology first argument, because you can make what is the ethical education that is being made inside of this debate. So it's up to you how you want to do that, but the point is that you want to make sure that your impact analysis is centered around the idea of education and who's producing the best education in the debate. And then the last play is the critique link turns the AF with a link to an external impact. So you are going to explain your link argument theory from a theoretical level. What does your philosophy say about this? And then you are going to explain why that theory also makes the impacts of the 1AC inevitable. So threat construction does a really good job of making arguments as to why that makes a self-fulfilling prophecy and makes those impacts inevitable and even makes those impacts more likely. And then you need to have an external impact. So if we think about going for threat construction, you might go for a game playing teaches us to think like the state and not think of people as humans, but merely objects. So that can have an external impact to maybe the Dylan calculation of life, disposability sort of arguments that exist. And then you would have something that turns the AF and saying that by them speaking into existence and making policy based upon threat construction, it makes those impacts inevitable, along with a sort of valued to life disposability argument that can be attached with it, which makes a really good sort of centralized link turns the AF with an external impact argument, which really allows you to sort of win the debate. So, I'm Daniel Stout of Johnson County Debate, and we just looked at the 5 different plays that you can utilize in the 2NR. It's important to think through, how does your criticism apply? How would you spin your critique for each one of those 5 plays, and which ones make more sense so that you can prioritize which plays you think are better for the 2NR and hierarchialize them to really sort of think about and be able to capitalize when you are winning a certain portion of the debate that the affirmative just stumbled upon. So hopefully you found that useful, and keep turning into debate learning to find out more about debate.